6 ancient puzzles, monumental ruins, cryptic technologies, and unreadable books that keep historians awake at night. This documentary will trace their contours, weigh the evidence, and point to one subtle pattern that ties them together. In the stones and scripts of a vanished past, there are questions that refuse to be answered, and in this film we follow those questions to the places where archaeology ends and wonder begins. Some discoveries shut down debate, others open a dozen doors. We will visit 6 such doors and listen for the sound of something unexplained on the other side. A carved pillar, a gearwork device, a manuscript in an impossible hand, each is a riddle. Together they whisper of knowledge that arrived too early, or remained deliberately hidden. The plain rises like a breath, wind combing across its bare ridges, and there, circling a grassless yard, stand massive pillars arranged with a deliberation that predates written kings. The setting, dawn light catches shallow bas-reliefs, hands of long-dead carvers captured in stone, animals that are not merely decorative but insist on meaning. Here, at the beginning of monumental architecture in the late Epipaleolithic, a site appears that rewrites chronology. Colossal carved stones constructed by communities who did not yet farm in the way later civilizations would. The conventional historical account places large, ritual enclosures and megalithic architecture many millennia after these layers. Yet here the stones stand older than the agricultural revolution long assumed necessary for such projects. Unexplained features include the precision of the megalithic joinery, the intentional arrangement of pillars into circular sanctuaries, and iconography that suggests symbolic systems more complex than subsistence society models would predict. Mainstream archaeology tends to explain it as the product of stable, seasonal gatherings of hunter-gatherer groups who could mobilize labor for episodic rituals. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal and bone anchor the structure to the 10th millennium BC. That explanation fits some evidence. Hearths, flint workshops, and midden deposits indicate prolonged and repeated occupation. Yet the scale and the coordinated planning, quarrying, carving, raising of T-shaped pillars, imply social mechanisms capable of sustaining collective projects over decades. Speculative, perhaps networks of exchange and ritual extended across vast territories in that era, enabling knowledge transfer and organization without agriculture as we define it today. Another speculative possibility suggests a deliberate attempt by a group with a cosmological agenda to encode astronomical cycles or social law in stone. Local oral echoes, later folk tales of stone houses of the first builders, and itinerant priests who could read the sky, linger in valley legends as faint embers, as if memory survived in myth. When you stand in that clearing and run your hand over the carved relief of a fox or a predator with human hands, the question is not merely how they made it but why they chose to make it in precisely that place and form. What did they intend to preserve in that shadowed circle of stone? Deep beneath the waves, where currents fold and the sea keeps its own slow counsel, a wooden crate of sorts once carried the secrets of a lost workshop. It was recovered by accident, a sponge diver's haul that revealed bronze fragments encrusted with the sea's growth. Among corroded gears and a wooden casing lay a mechanism of astonishing complexity, geared wheels with teeth cut to precise ratios, pointers calibrated to celestial cycles, and inscriptions fragmentary but purposeful. Scholars dated the mechanism to the Hellenistic era using surviving metals and associated artifacts, and yet its presence reveals a sophistication of instrument making that modern historians had thought would not coalesce until generations later. The unexplained features are many: a miniature analog computer able to predict lunar phases, eclipses, and the positions of planets, workmanship accurate enough to suggest a deep tradition of gearmaking, and the absence of comparable devices in the surviving written record. The mainstream explanation situates it within a tradition of scientific artisanship flourishing around a learned elite. Astronomical observation, mathematics, and hands-on engineering coexisted in certain port cities that connected trade, ideas, and materials. This view is bolstered by fragmentary treatises that allude to mechanical devices and by the mathematics of the era, which was sufficiently advanced to conceive of such instruments. Speculative. Could this object be the survivor of a whole class of instruments used by schools of craftsmen whose outputs were perishable or repurposed? Or does it imply a lost workshop tradition with technical manuals never preserved? A local detail humanizes the cold bits of bronze. An epigraphic fragment, once conserved, was found to contain the names of craftsmen alongside mystic symbols, artisans who signed their work in the way master carpenters later did in other cultures. We are left to imagine the sound of metal teeth meshing, the soft rasp of a file, and the conversation between scholar and mechanic as sky and lab combined. If they could build an analog model of the heavens, what else could their hands have produced? A book arrives like a sealed room, vellum leaves bound and stitched, ink in strange greens and browns, script that resists every alphabetic key. Time and again researchers have tried to fold this manuscript into known scripts, to press it into the typologies of any language, and it refuses. Radiocarbon testing dates its pages to the early 15th century, and yet its botanical and astronomical illustrations mix species and stars in combinations that do not correspond to a single known place. Unexplained features include a script with no clear linguistic ancestry, drawings that depict plants not readily identifiable, and astronomical diagrams that hint at a different cosmology. Mainstream academic voices mostly treat it as a ciphertext, a book in code, perhaps a pharmacopoeia or a personal notebook, and approach it with statistical linguistics, pattern analysis, and computerized frequency analysis. Those methods have yielded tantalizing results. Zip-like distributions suggest the text behaves like a natural language. Repeated word patterns imply morphology. Still, no consensus has been reached on its language family, if any. Speculative theories range from an invented private cipher to arguments that the manuscript encodes a constructed language tied to an isolated intellectual community. A small, poignant human detail, centuries-old marginalia, faint handprints pressed into parchment by some anxious reader, the smudge of a thumb on a recipe page, suggest a person, or a chain of readers, who handled these pages intimately. The manuscript's most persistent mystery is not merely the content but its silence. The book keeps its counsel with the stubbornness of a vault. If the pages hold knowledge, why did it remain unreadable even to those closest to it? The desert floor is a map written at a scale no single foot could comprehend. Lines run like a deliberate wind across hardpan, figures, birds, spiders, geometric corridors, stretching for kilometers, their meaning legible only from the air or by a distant vantage that ancient walkers could not have had. These geoglyphs are not merely marks but choreography in earth and stone, long straight avenues that connect pictographs, spirals that open into plazas, and repeated motifs that insist on ritual. The unexplained features are immediate, the sheer scale of certain figures that require a bird's-eye perspective to appreciate, the precision of lines cut into bedrock and maintained across centuries, and the astonishing alignment of some motifs with astronomical events or nearby water sources. Mainstream archaeology generally interprets these works as expressions of ritual landscape design, pathways for processions, markers of sacred geography, or mnemonic devices linked to seasonal cycles. Scholars emphasize ethnographic parallels where communal rites trace routes across the land, and radiocarbon samples from associated campsites place much of this activity in a clear cultural horizon. Still, unresolved questions remain. Why were some images drawn with a single, steady incision across undulating terrain, without visible correction? How did builders coordinate measurements across valleys without aerial vantage points? Speculative possibilities range from the practical, long sighting lines established from hilltops and repeated measuring using cords and pacing, to the symbolic, geosignatures meant to be read by ephemeral visitors, mythic birds, or celestial passengers in a cosmology where the sky and land were folded together. A human detail softens the scale. Local oral fragments recall elders leading children along narrow causeways at dawn, telling of ancestors who painted the earth so the sky might remember them. The lines remain both message and silence, labor frozen into a landscape. If these marks were meant to be seen only from above, who or what were they trying to reach? Maps are seldom innocent things. They carry the weight of knowledge, trade, and ambition. One cloth map, drawn with ink and annotated by a hand that names ports and notes channels, puzzles because its coastlines sometimes match shores that, according to conventional timelines, were not yet accurately charted. The unexplained features here are twofold: specific coastal contours that mirror now submerged shelf patterns and not always identical with contemporary coastline, and a degree of detail. Rivers, capes, inlets, rendered with a precision that suggests access to very old source material or observational data beyond the assumed reach of its era. Mainstream historians explain such anomalies by proposing that cartographers compiled earlier charts, portal on maps, sailors' routings, and fragmentary voyages, and stitched them together, embellishing from memory and oral reports. They point to the patchwork nature of pre-modern cartography, where a manuscript becomes a palimpsest of earlier, local charts. Yet, alternative readings persist. Some researchers argue that a handful of maps preserve older coastal knowledge, perhaps gathered in an age when sea levels were different, or when surveying methods recorded bathymetric shadows now lost to erosion. Others caution that later redrawings or copying errors can create the illusion of coastal accuracy where none existed. A touching archival detail, a marginal note by a seafarer who scrawled a brief lament about islands that took my anchor, beside a sketch of a reef, suggesting intimate, dangerous knowledge of places only a few hands had seen. Whether the map is a faithful copy of older knowledge, a clever synthesis of reports, or a relic of a now vanished surveying tradition, it remains a map that insists on questions it will not answer outright. What stories were folded into that paper, and whose eyes first traced those forgotten shores? At the edge of an ancient quarried plain, massive stones lie like the bones of a sleeping giant, cut, dressed, and juxtaposed with such precision that mortar seems a later afterthought. These blocks, some so heavy they defy casual measurement, rest in courses that fit with near impossible seams. The unexplained features are headline-making: stones transported across valleys, raised and set with joints so tight that even a thin blade could not pass between them, peck marks and cut lines that suggest sophisticated stoneworking techniques, and an architectural plan that implies an engineering vocabulary sustained across generations. Mainstream architectural history offers practical reconstructions, lever systems, earthen ramps, sledges lubricated with water or plant oil, and the steady coordination of large labor cohorts, demonstrating that human muscle and ingenuity can explain the movement and placement of megaliths without resorting to esoteric technologies. Experimental archaeology has shown that with planning, ropes, and time, even enormous stones can be moved and fitted. Yet the scale here sometimes pushes plausibility. Certain blocks exceed the weight of previously reproduced transports, and quarried blocks appear pre-cut to sizes unmatched by the methods demonstrably used in the same era elsewhere. Speculative theories range from refined, now lost hoisting techniques to the reuse of earlier foundations, architectural palimpsests where later builders inherited and adapted an older, more massive framework. A quietly human element, an old ledger discovered near a workers' camp lists names and rations, the faded handwriting a reminder that behind monumental stones stood individuals, families, and forms of social obligation. Standing before those joints, one feels the tension between brute force and exquisite planning. Did human hands and common tools achieve the extraordinary by slow refinement, or do those seams record an engineering vocabulary we have yet to read? The submerged halls of a drowned city lie catalogued in sonar sweeps, amphora stacks and building footprints caught where tides now claim memory. Diverse and remote cameras return photographs of submerged streets, columns toppled into silt, and ceramic sherds that bear trade marks from distant shores. The unexplained elements here are both material and contextual. Why was an urban center abandoned or submerged with such suddenness in the archaeological layer? Why are some structures unusually advanced, drainage systems, paved thoroughfares, relative to regional contemporaries? Mainstream interpretations commonly attribute submergence to seismic uplift and subsidence, historical tectonic activity, or gradual sea level rise. Abandonment narratives often fit within patterns of economic reorientation, warfare, or environmental stress. Yet certain features resist simplified explanation, evidence of carefully stacked personal effects left behind, hearths with fresh burning residues, and administrative tablets that cease mid-account, suggesting abrupt disruption rather than slow decline. Speculative readings ask whether a catastrophic event, an earthquake-triggered tsunami, a sudden inundation following lagoon breaching, might explain the pattern, or whether political decisions to relocate, perhaps in the face of disease or enforced resettlement, produced a deliberately blanked urban footprint. A human vignette steadies the image, a small bronze figurine recovered with the clasp of a child's bracelet, its patina telling of hurried abandonment. The submerged city is a palimpsest of normalcy in crisis. The silence in the archives rings as loudly as the bells once might have. If the sea took a city in a single breath, what voices vanished with its streets? In the hush of an old ruins library lay a catalog entry for a set of carved spheres, polished stone eggs with incised lines, sometimes joined by metallic inlays or drilled axial holes. The spheres are small enough to hold but intricate enough to attract the attention of both antiquarians and experimentalists. They are found in disparate contexts, sometimes among ritual assemblages, sometimes in workshop debris. Unexplained features include machining marks that suggest rotational symmetry beyond what simple pecking and rubbing would produce, internal structuring in some specimens that hints at hidden cavities or composite assembly, and contextual ambiguity. Are they votive objects, measuring instruments, or decorative playthings? Mainstream scholarship often favors symbolic or ritual explanations, stones as cosmograms, fertility emblems, or objects marking status. Ethnoarchaeological parallels show the ease with which small, polished objects can accrue symbolic value across cultures. Still, the sphere's mechanical subtleties provoke alternative readings. In a few cases, the sphere's geometry is consistent with attempts to model spherical astronomy, globe-making, or to serve as bearings in proto-mechanical assemblies. Speculative proposals suggest they could represent an experimental phase in materials science, or be surviving fragments of lost devices. A human node deepens the matter. A mason's pocket ledger once found near a cash list payment for rounding and insetting, implying craftspeople received compensation for producing spherical objects of exacting tolerances. The spheres, small and patient, refused to be categorized neatly. Were they the playful handiwork of artisans, or the deliberate experiments of proto-engineers testing the geometry of the sphere? Beneath a sun that remembers the footsteps of laborers long gone, a network of carved channels and cistern snakes across a basalt plain, their geometry insisting on an engineer's eye. The scene opens in a ravine where water, when it comes, must be caught and tamed. Here, rock-cut conduits funnel seasonal floods into chambers sealed by dressed stone lids. Archaeologists date these works to periods when settled agriculture required dependable water storage for towns clustered on marginal lands. The unexplained features are the precision of gradients carved into living rock, the use of step-settling basins that demonstrate an understanding of sedimentation control, and aqueduct mouths placed at heights that imply accurate measurement across long distances. Mainstream explanations place these constructions in the domain of practical hydraulic planning, the handiwork of communities that learned, often through painful trial and error, to stretch scarce rainfall into reliable crop yields. Engineers employed simple levels, sight lines, and iterative adjustment. Yet some channels show alignments and gradations so refined that experimental replication has challenged modern teams. Why would communities invest such scarce labor into a microengineering that looks like the work of a trained hydraulic specialist? Speculative ideas propose itinerant specialists, skilled artisans who travel between communities offering hydraulic know-how, or guild traditions of water engineering transmitted empirically through apprenticeship. A small human detail brings the stone to life. Graffiti scratched into a cistern lid, initials and an awkward heart, testifies to everyday users who once leaned on those stones while waiting for water to fill. If they could measure the slow geometry of water, what else did they measure with such care? In a dim, smoke-streaked workshop packed with slag and crucible fragments, thin sheets of hammered metal and tiny wire-like filaments point toward a crafts tradition that practiced subtlety rather than spectacle. The artifacts in question are small, decorative plates and filigree work whose alloys combine unexpected proportions, trace elements that modern metallurgists find curious for the apparent period. The unexplained features include microstructural evidence of controlled cooling rates in small castings, solder joints so delicate they require magnification, and alloy recipes that imply knowledge of metallic behavior beyond the crude bronze or iron smelting of many contemporaries. Mainstream metalworkers' history suggests regional workshops achieved remarkable refinements by iterative experimentation and trade in exotic materials. The presence of specialist furnaces, crucible compositions, and skilled hammerers can account for much. Still, when an object's microchemistry points to a deliberate addition of minute percentages of rarer metals, elements not commonly sought for decorative plates, the question arises whether knowledge of alloying effects was systematic rather than accidental. Speculative explanations include lost treatises on metallurgy, itinerant smiths carrying secret recipes, or craftsmen embedded in trans-regional exchange networks who had access to exotic ores. A human trace surfaces in a letter fragment, a paycheck scribbled to a named master of small things, confirming that certain individuals were paid for exquisite, minute work. Were these tiny wonders the province of artisans experimenting with materials, or did they encode a practical metallurgy now lost? High on a windswept ridge, a shallow stone enclosure uses the horizon itself as a dial. Stones sight along sunrise points at key calendar moments, while inner markers suggest computations of lunar cycles. The site's archaeological layer dates to a period when societies increasingly regulated agricultural and ritual calendars through observation. The unexplained features are exact horizon markers set not by chance but by repeated alignment, the co-location of nocturnal observational platforms with daytime ritual spaces, and inscriptions that hint at a community calendar carefully watching both the sun's extremes and the moon's long-period standstills. Mainstream archaeoastronomy reads these as local observatories, community-managed places where knowledge of the heavens regulated planting and ceremony, and supports the interpretation with seasonal ritual residues and corrected orientation studies. Yet the precision of certain alignments seems to exceed practical ritual needs, hinting instead at a proto-scientific practice. Records of eclipse cycles and lunisolar reconciliations would require long-term observations and a mathematical apparatus for prediction. Speculative accounts posit that such sites were nodes and networks where information about celestial cycles traveled between observation points, enabling a rudimentary predictive astronomy. Another possibility is that these were competition arenas for priestly classes to exhibit their knowledge. A human detail steadies the sky, a weathered token, an engraved bone marked with tally strokes, appears to be a counting aid, an intimate tool of an observer marking a celestial event night by night. If people watched the heavens with such discipline, who kept those records and why? Beneath streets and beneath the loam of a forgotten district runs a lattice of tunnels, some carved as drainage, others large enough to walk through. For centuries, subterranean passages have been practical, conduits for water, paths for clandestine movement, storage depressions. But in a particular complex, tunnels intersect at unexpected angles and feature chambers carved with acoustic considerations, reverberant domes and whispering niches, suggesting design choices beyond pure necessity. Unexplained features include alignments that avoid geological weaknesses, intentional acoustic properties, and threshold carvings whose symbolism does not match the more public art above ground. Mainstream readings treat subterranean architecture as multifunctional, clandestine rites, cooling storage, escape routes, or sacred liminality spaces. Builders adapted to geology, reused older lines, and sometimes created spaces shaped by ritual needs. Still, when acoustic study reveals carefully tuned domes producing specific harmonics when struck, the possibility that chambers were designed to produce sound as part of ritual or communicative practice becomes plausible. Speculative ideas explore sonic rituality, ancient communities manipulating sound to produce altered states, or subterranean relay systems used to communicate across complex settlements. A humanizing anecdote survives, an old song collected from village elders' references. Voices in the stone, guiding couples to the cool dark in midsummer, as if memory preserved ritual usage in lullabies. Were these tunnels merely practical conduits, or engineered stages for sound and secrecy? Across the varied anomalies discussed so far, a concentration that includes monumental pillars, geoglyphs, sophisticated portable instruments, and carefully aligned observation sites, an empirical pattern emerges. A disproportionate number of these discoveries occur near ancient crossroads of trade and exchange, or in landscapes that bridge coastal and inland routes. suggesting that information and techniques spread along physical networks of commerce and pilgrimage rather than appearing in isolated invention bubbles. This observation is grounded in site provenance data and distribution studies of artifacts associated with exchange hubs, though the precise causal pathways and timelines remain subjects for ongoing scholarship. Citation needed: a small ritual deposit, found beneath the flagstones of a market square, holds the next enigma. A cache of tokens, thin, labeled discs stamped with symbols that appear neither weight standards nor straightforward currency, yet arranged carefully by material and incision. The context suggests commercial activity, and yet the disc's inscriptions do not match any mint standard weight system known in surrounding assemblages. The unexplained features include the regular sizing of discs that nonetheless vary in density and alloy, an iconography that repeats in marketplace clusters but never maps neatly to a single known script. Mainstream economic archaeology would place such tokens within a spectrum of credit devices, placeholders in long-distance exchange, or tally markers used by traders to track deliveries. Anthropological parallels show token economies where credit underpins exchange, particularly in networks where coinage is scarce. Yet the peculiar mix of symbolic marks and variable material composition hints that these tokens might have also carried encoded information, ownership marks, route identifiers, or guild certifications. Speculative interpretations propose a proto-accounting shorthand used by merchant families, or even a private tagging system for consignments moving under broker supervision. A human detail surfaces in a ledger smear, a clerk's hurried note referencing 3 discs missing. Beside a tally marks the vulnerability and value attributed to these small, portable signatures of trust. Were these tokens simple IOUs, or keys to a hidden ledger of trust and routes? In a low valley, terraces cling to slopes as if stitched there by a patient seamstress. Irrigation channels feed a patchwork of small fields and terraces, and in one terrace system archaeologists found interlocking stone components shaped to accept wooden beams that no longer survive. The unexplained elements are the precision-cut mortises, so tightly fit that the beams would have rotated with mechanical assistance, and traces of were consistent with moving mechanisms rather than static structures. Mainstream agricultural history explains terraces and beams as part of irrigation and simple millworks, sluice gates and grain-crushing devices. But marks of rotational wear inside stone collars raise the possibility that some terraces integrated mechanical lifts or counterweights to raise irrigation boards, a kind of low-tech automation in landscape management. Speculative threads suggest community-scale mechanization, millwrights adapting simple machines to move water and goods, or proto-industrial craft clusters concentrating experimental mechanical knowledge. A human vignette remains, a small carved token of a wheel found near a domestic hearth, perhaps a child's toy or a symbolic charm, hinting that the presence of wheels and motion occupied both practical and mental space in these communities. If terraces held moving parts, how widespread was mechanical imagination in ordinary rural life? At the margin of a great trade corridor, archaeologists excavated a workshop whose waste included not only metal filings but also fragments of polished glass and beads of an unusual green. The workshop's assemblage implies artisans produced items for high-status clientele and traders alike. The unexplained features here include the presence of optical quality glass fragments and polished lenses among decorative goods, and 2 marks that indicate deliberate shaping for curvature, suggesting a rudimentary knowledge of optics. Mainstream craft histories acknowledge glassworking in many ancient craft centers and occasional production of polished ornaments. Optical applications, however, usually appear later in the historical record. Yet the existence of curved, polished pieces raises questions: were they purely decorative, or used as magnifiers, inspection tools, or even components of devices? Speculative ideas range from the practical, inspectors using lenses to check metal surfaces, to the extraordinary, optical elements used in observational devices or ritual burning mirrors. A human trace appears in a customer account etched into a ledger, a wealthy patron requested small lenses for close work, implying craftsmen made and sold items for detailed visual tasks. Were these polished pieces mere ornaments, or the first lenses through which someone learned to look differently? Beneath layers of loam and salt, A cluster of fired clay cylinders sometimes appears in excavation reports like a punctuation, small, hollow, corroded at the rim, their interiors stained by mineral traces that refuse to sit easily with straightforward cataloging. These objects have been interpreted by some as simple storage vessels and by others as components of lamps, but in a few contexts their arrangement, paired with copper rods and acidic residues, has invited a different reading, that of an electrochemical device. The unexplained features include deliberate tubular forms sized to contain a rod and an electrolyte, residues consistent with weak acids, and association with small metallic fittings that suggest electrical contact. Mainstream conservators caution strongly, ancient people fermented, stored, and processed acids for many purposes, and contact between copper and organic matter can generate detectable residues without implying deliberate electricity use. Experimental replications show that a sealed vessel with a copper rod and an iron core will produce a small volt potential under certain conditions, yet whether artisans exploited this habit for lighting, electroplating, medicinal ritual, or simple chemical reactions is uncertain. Speculative perspectives propose pragmatic uses: surface gilding through electrochemical processes, metalworking aids, or ritual objects intended to surprise or impress, rather than the anachronistic image of ancient batteries powering lamps. A very human trace persists in a note penned by an early excavator, curious and amused. "Little jars that might hum if wired." A line combining wonder and the modesty of 19th century field notes. If these small vessels could produce a whisper of current, who would have known how to listen? Carved into clay with a deliberate hand is a disc stamped by a spiral of stamped signs that repeat and then change, a text laid like a braid across a baked surface. The disc resists easy reading. Does it encode a list, a prayer, a calendar? Its stylized impressions are neither clearly alphabetic nor wholly pictographic. Mainstream epigraphers approach such artifacts cautiously. Local scripts can evolve and diverge rapidly. A short, repetitive inscription might be administrative shorthand or a mnemonic game. Short inscriptions complicate decipherment because statistical methods rely on large corpora. Yet the disc's manufacture is precise. The impressions were made with stamps or a rolling cylinder, implying an ordered system of signs and a workshop producing multiple exemplars. Speculative explanations include an administrative stamp for tracking shipments, a liturgical token with ritual recitations encoded in compressed form, or even an experimental script designed to record particular objects rather than spoken language. Humanizing the object, an adjacent deposit contained a child's toy, a small clay animal, suggesting domestic proximity, everyday life and bureaucratic or ritual practice interwoven. Was this disc an ordinary accountant's slip, or a deliberately compacted text meant for a select few? Far from quarries and workshops, on an exposed headland where wind and sea shape memory itself, stand enormous carved figures whose facial proportions and body plans diverge from later iconographies in perplexing ways. The statues' massing, the painstaking rendering of torsos and hands, and their deliberate orientation toward the open ocean provoke a host of interpretations. Mainstream archaeologists have catalogued their stylistic lineage, argued for staged carving sequences, and shown how local stone quality dictated technique. Ethnographic parallels point to ancestor veneration and territorial markers. Yet unresolved features linger. Transport logs are sparse or non-existent, quarry scars do not always correspond neatly to the nearest workable rock, and some statues exhibit internal cavities and bronze fittings that indicate movable elements once attached, implying that these figures were not purely static monuments. Speculative reconstructions have proposed that finished statues could have been dressed with organic materials, insets, or devices to animate or ritualize them. Others suggest they were ritually activated during ceremonies involving sound and light. An intimate domestic fragment, a child's clay whistle carved in miniature of the same style, suggests that the aesthetic language of the monuments percolated into everyday objects, knitting the monumental to the familiar. If those figures once moved or sounded, what stories did they tell when the sea wind carried them outward? A series of cut and dress blocks in an urban defensive wall display seems so improbable they force a double take. Joints that interlock like puzzle pieces, stone surfaces polished to mirror flatness on contact planes, and courses that ride the hillside in a way that resists simple, repetitive ramp and lever explanations. Mainstream engineering accounts emphasize incremental development. Generations improve quarrying, dressing, and setting. Reuse of earlier foundations produces seemingly impossible fits, and specialized teams of stoneworkers evolve skills through apprenticeship. Experimental archaeology reproduces many feats with patient labor. Still, some walls incorporate megalithic blocks that exceed the practical weights of the more commonly replicated pieces, carved with tolerances that suggest templates, or measuring devices beyond simple eyeballing. Speculative proposals range from refined templating systems and jigs lost to time to the possibility that blocks were shaped while still in the bedrock and then detached, preserving precise mating surfaces. A human ledger, an account of food rations for journeymen and master carvers, reminds us these feats were social achievements as much as technical ones. The fitting of stone required coordination, planning, and the social will to see a project over years. If those seams are the product of workshop templates, what craft manuals were burned or misplaced along the way? In a dry gulch where sunlight bleaches the bones of old settlements, archaeologists found an assemblage of small polished bone plaques incised with notches and spirals, things that at first glance appear like tokens of game or simple tally devices. Yet their context suggests more. Many appear in ritual niches, others in elite burials, and a subset carry microscopic residues of pigments and plant oils. Unexplained features include repetitive incisions that track lunar-like cycles across series of plaques, and occasional overlay markings that suggest updates or corrections. Mainstream analysis reads such artifacts as mnemonic aids, personal notebooks for counting days, months, or ritual recitations, or as scoring pieces for games and social exchange. Ethnographic parallels give credence to mnemonic objects used by non-literate societies. Speculative interpretations expand the possibilities. Perhaps they were personal almanacs, teaching tools for apprentices, or the private registers of priest-scribes who used objects rather than parchment. A human echo comes from a burial dish with a plaque tucked beneath the deceased's head, as if the plaque's owner wanted their counting companion to accompany them beyond life's ledger. Were these plaques practical tallies, or intimate calendars folded into flesh and faith? Not all sophisticated technology leaves heavy traces. In certain rock shelters, delicate pigments and binders adhere to walls that, when analyzed, reveal compounds made from complex procedures, mixtures of plant gums, mineral powders, and binders treated to resist water and abrasion. The unexplained features include recipes that produce hues and sheen unexpected for their contexts, and layered painting sequences implying meticulous conservation or redecoration practices. Mainstream conservation science acknowledges the ingenuity of pigment recipes. Craftspeople ground minerals, combined binders, and developed varnishes for durability. Yet the sophistication of some binders, chemical profiles that modern analysts find difficult to recreate precisely, hints at a depth of empirical chemistry sometimes underestimated in pre-industrial contexts. Speculative angles propose guild-level knowledge of materials science, and perhaps itinerant colorists passing techniques along trade routes. A human detail focuses the work, fingerprints embedded in a varnish layer, now fossilized in paint, a direct impression of a maker's hand pressing pigment onto a palette. If colors were made to last and shine, who taught the apprentices their secret blends? A small ceramic lamp with a carefully constructed reflector and a trace of a sooty film suggests, when analyzed, that ancient artisans were experimenting with directed light. In another site, a carved channel in stone fits a bronze mirror so precisely the two appear as though designed together. The unexplained feature here is the consistency with which artisans across disparate regions attempted to manipulate light, reflectors, mirrors, lenses, and polished surfaces cropping up at archaeological horizons separated by distance yet similar in purpose. Mainstream historians point to practical uses: improved lighting for workshops, magnification for fine tasks, and cosmetic mirrors for ritual grooming. But the repetition suggests a common cognitive step: humans identifying the properties of reflective materials and refining them to practical ends. Speculative commentary wonders whether optical aids informed visual culture more broadly. Did inspection through a lens change how craftsmen judged fineness, or how ritual makers staged light in sacred spaces? A surviving account book entry referencing payment for mirror polishing humanizes the labor. When someone first bent light to their will, who noticed the world changing through that gleam? A weathered archive chest once opened in a monastery cellar yields not only parchments but also fragments of technical sketches, rulers marked in half units, ink diagrams of pulley ratios, and marginalia that measure the pitch of a screw with the same hand that writes a litany. The scene is intimate, a candle guttering beside an inkpot, a scholar's wrist smudged with lampsoot, and a dozen small calculations that look like shop notes rather than theological meditation. The unexplained feature is the mingling of devotional text and mechanical notation, the presence of engineering thought in places assumed to concern only the spirit. Mainstream historians argue this is natural. Religious houses were repositories of practical knowledge, scriptoria that preserved cosmological and technical learning alike. Monks copied agricultural treatises, schematic recipes, and measurements used by their communities, practicalities wrapped in piety. Yet the precision of some diagrams and the recurrence of identical measurement units across distant scriptoria suggest transmission networks of technical knowledge that operated under different social logics than the texts they accompanied. Speculative possibilities propose itinerant craftsmen who taught in cloisters, or clerical orders that deliberately cultivated mechanical literacy as part of estate management. A human detail, a prayer tucked into a folded sheet of schematics, the hand asking for patience in both faith and craft, which reminds us that counting and supplication once shared the same desk. If prayer and pulley shared paper, who read both with equal devotion? In a windswept plain, a ring of stones surrounds a shallow pit where a cluster of humbler artifacts, spindle whorls, loom weights, and fragments of dyed thread, tells a quieter technology story. Textile making is often invisible in the grand narratives of monuments and weapons, yet dyes and weaving techniques bear signatures of advanced chemistry, mordants that fix color, layered weaves that affect light and tensile strength, and dye recipes that use mordants and combinations resulting in tones difficult to reproduce without solid empirical knowledge. Mainstream craft archaeology rightly emphasizes textiles as economic engines. Every household produced cloth, clothing correlated to status, and trade in cloth drove markets. Yet when chemical analysis reveals complex dye recipes and thread twist patterns consistent with standardized workshop production, a different picture emerges. Organized textile industries with quality control, apprentices, and perhaps guild regulations. Speculative interpretations suggest that the mastery of color, and we've enabled social signaling and even encoded identity in patterns readable across kilometers. A humanizing trace appears in a woman's inventory scratched on wooden tablet, list of yarn, day labor payments, and a small note. Keep the blue for the festival. The private regard for public appearance. If colors and knots proclaimed identity, who read those codes at a glance? A compact, carefully stacked hoard of coins and ingots discovered beneath a threshold invites both fiscal and ritual explanations. The hoard's composition is odd. Standardized coinage from several issuing authorities, raw ingots of differing alloy composition, and a handful of stamp tokens with iconography that mirrors no known ruler. The unexplained elements include the deliberate mixing of raw and minted forms, and the symbolic placement, beneath a threshold, not in a mercantile chest, suggesting a ritual deposition as much as a cache for safekeeping. Mainstream economic historians note that hoarding often responds to instability, war, taxation, or climate shocks, and that ritual concealment of wealth is a common cross-cultural practice intended to secure household prosperity. Yet the presence of mixed monetary forms hints at transitional economies where exchange systems overlapped. Tokens might have served as trust instruments in networks where multiple authorities circulated coin, or as a portable ledger of credit. Speculative lines of thought suggest this hoard is a microcosm of monetary experimentation, local authorities issuing credit alongside circulating imperial coins. A human fragment appears in the scratch of a hurried tally on the threshold's underside, a widow's mark, perhaps, etched before the box was slid into earth, a private act of protection. Was that mixed hoard a pragmatic nest egg, or a prayer for prosperity disguised as savings? Far inland, beyond the easy reach of seaports, an elaborate road system, cut terraces, bridged gullies, and paved causeways, binds a network of settlements with a coherence that suggests centralized planning rather than ad hoc footpaths. The unexplained features are concentrated in the road engineering, drainage culverts integrated with way stations, repeated small standardized milestones, and pavement techniques that resist simple replication. Mainstream settlement archaeology posits that trade and administrative control naturally produce improved roadways, and experimental reconstructions show how incremental investment yields durable routes. But the ubiquity of identical milestones, markers with the same iconography and measurement units separated by hundreds of kilometers, argues for a level of administrative standardization often assumed to be a feature of later imperial systems. Speculative accounts propose proto-bureaucratic coordination across polities, merchant guild sponsorship of infrastructure, or even calendar-linked roadwork organized around seasonal labor. A human vignette, a traveler's graffito burned into lime mortar, passed on the solstice, bread vanished. A small human complaint that indexes the lived experience of movement and the social rhythms that roadways sustained. If roads carried more than traders, what institutions carved those waymarkers into the land? In a sunlit courtyard of a ruined palatial complex, a set of small, worked bone and ivory tools includes an object of peculiar refinement, a narrow, curved implement with a serrated edge whose microwear indicates repeated contact with fine metal filings and organic residues consistent with plant resins. The object's apparent use, delicate scraping and application, suggests a craft of combining organic and inorganic materials at a microscopic level. The unexplained features are the cross-disciplinary nature of the tool's residues, evidence of working metal, preparing paints, and manipulating leather all on the same implement. Mainstream craft histories note the overlapping toolkits of small-scale workshops, where a single artisan might practice multiple trades. Yet the repeated co-occurrence of metallurgical and pigment residues in a controlled context implies either a multi-specialist workshop or a highly versatile artisan whose training blurred craft boundaries. Speculative ideas point to craft clusters where knowledge circulated freely, enabling innovations like composite objects, metal inlays set into organic matrices, pigments reinforced by fine metal powders, practices that could look like alchemy to outside eyes. A human touch surfaces in a mother's name scratched into a workbench edge, a small marker of pride and ownership within a workshop economy. If artisans merge materials and techniques, who recognize the value of such hybrid expertise? A cliff face painted with successive layers of motifs shows a curious conservational practice. Older images were not obliterated but integrated, new strokes weaving around earlier figures, creating palimpsests of iconography that record changes in ritual emphasis without erasing memory. The unexplained aspect is the deliberate conservation ethic implied, later painters preserving earlier lines as they added new meanings, rather than overwriting them. Mainstream interpretations view such layering as natural. Pictures accumulate as rituals change, but the conscious integration of earlier imagery, the matching of pigment recipes to older palettes, and the choice to preserve rather than scrape paint indicate an awareness of history and a desire to maintain continuity. Speculative readings propose that certain communities maintain curated visual archives as communal memory aids, teaching new generations through a visible lineage of image and meaning. A human fragment, a child's handprint added in ochre to a later layer, cements the social continuity. Memory is both official and familial. If each new image honored what came before, who decided which memories were worth preserving on the wall? For the viewer who has followed these scenes across stone, sea, and script, a thread begins to thicken. Techniques and know-how are less often the sudden fruit of isolated genius than the accumulated product of movement, people, goods, and ideas moving along trade routes, pilgrimage paths, and administrative arteries. The repeated appearance of specialized crafts near hubs of exchange, the survival of templates and measurement units across distant sites, and the recurrence of administrative shorthand in diverse contexts all point toward a distributed network of knowledge transfer. This is not to collapse ingenuity into mere imitation. Instead, it reframes mystery as a question about the social vehicles of skill. Did itinerant technicians carry templates in their chests? Did merchant families sponsor workshops that served as living libraries of technique? Or did religious institutions act as custodians, preserving and transmitting practical knowledge alongside sacred texts. Speculative but grounded, the connective clue hinted at earlier, the correlation between anomalous finds and ancient crossroads, suggests that where people met, they exchanged more than goods. They traded methods, apprentices, and secrets. This pattern remains robust in the dataset of sites discussed here, but it raises another question that presses against the documentary's promise. If knowledge moved along networks, why did detailed technical vocabularies vanish in some places while surviving in others? If trade routes were classrooms, what determined which lessons endured and which were lost? Beneath a canopy of reed and thatch, an acoustic array of clay and wood waits for the wind, a row of tuned pipes embedded in a communal wall, their mouths carefully flared and their lengths varying in precise proportions. When a breeze passes, a low, communal tone issues, an unplanned choir that becomes, in context, a timed signal for gatherings or signaling across distances. The unexplained features are the apparent intentionality of tuning, the recurrence of similar arrays in disparate settlements, and the placement of some pipes in threshold positions that suggest a link between soundscape and social boundary. Mainstream ethnomusicology reminds us that sound is integral to ritual and everyday life. Tuned pipes, bow roars, and signaling horns appear in many independent traditions for communicating across terrain or marking ceremonial moments. Yet the precision here, the use of fractional lengths and consistent bore shaping, hints at empirical acoustical knowledge, perhaps learned through apprenticeship or transmitted along exchange routes. Speculative readings ask whether acoustic arrays served not only as signals but as engineered environments for ritual induction, where sound frequencies were exploited to alter attention or elicit trance. A human vignette tempers technique. A child's drawing scratched into an adjacent beam depicts the pipes in a procession, suggesting that the soundscape was part of communal memory and play. If a wall could sing and call a village to order, who first learned to shape wind into a shared voice? Under layers of urban fill, a network of vaulted drains and stepped sewers testifies to an attention to public health that surprises casual assumptions about ancient cities. Channels slope with care. Settling basins intercept silt. Access shafts allow cleaning crews entry. And in some districts, cesspits bear lining that preserves organic matter in an oxygen-poor tomb. The unexplained elements include a systematic distribution of waste infrastructure correlated with population density, and the occasional discovery of early filtration media, sand and charcoal layers, suggesting attempts at water clarification. Mainstream urban archaeology knows that cities innovate to manage waste and water. Public baths, drainage, and regulated well fields are familiar civic features. Still, the presence of filtration and engineered gray water diversion in contexts earlier than many canonical examples invites us to reconsider the timeline of sanitary engineering. Speculative propositions include specialized municipal offices overseeing sanitation, or private contractors who monopolized cleaning and filtration knowledge as a profitable service. A human detail lends texture, graffiti scrawled on a drain access stone. "Luca cleaned this," offers the faint satisfaction of an unsung municipal worker claiming credit. If cities cleaned after themselves with such thought, who organized the labor that kept filth at bay? At the heart of a cultivated enclosure, trimmed hedges and patterned beds conceal a gardener's laboratory. Terraces with altered soil horizons, pits where subtropical plants are protected, and stone-lined beds that increase warmth and drainage. Botanical remains here show a spectrum of species, some local, others introduced, that do not always align with straightforward diffusion models. The unexplained features are horticultural practices that anticipate greenhouse effects, sheltered beds, south-facing walls for heat accumulation, and mulching sequences using specific organic compounds that conserve moisture and perhaps deter pests. Mainstream agrohistory acknowledges long traditions of managed gardens, kitchen gardens, temple groves, and experimental plots, but seldom assigns systematic experimentation with microclimates this early. Speculative trajectories posit itinerant gardeners who gathered plants along trade routes and cultivated them experimentally, or elite patrons sponsoring plant trials to secure exotic flavors and medicinal species. A small human trace, a pressed leaf folded into a ledger alongside a recipe, hints at the gardener's role as both scientist and steward, preserving botanical knowledge across seasons. If gardeners bent microclimate to will, what new plants and cures did they coax into being? A sealed archive chamber, unearthed in a collapsed storeroom, yields bundles of leather tags tied to cords. Each tag bears a sequence of punched marks and abbreviated symbols, some repeated, some unique. The tags function like a distributed ledger, portable, durable, and accessible to those initiated into the sign system. The unexplained facet is how such coded physical ledgers integrated with larger administrative systems. Where were the master copies kept? How were errors reconciled? And who certified the tag's authority? Mainstream administrative history points to the pragmatic use of tags and tally sticks in pre-literate bureaucracies. Portable markers permitted transactions where literacy was scarce but trust networks were strong. Yet the sophistication of some tag systems, hierarchical marks, color-coding traces, and companion seals, implies formalized training and perhaps a class of clerks whose skill translated tokens into records. Speculative possibilities imagine itinerant auditors carrying master keys to systems of marks, or guild-controlled certification ensuring trust across distances. A human touch appears in a small smear of soot and oil on one tag, perhaps the thumbprint of the clerk who validated the mark, a tiny fingerprint that synchronized trust to a named hand. If leather tags carried the weight of contracts, who learned their language and who enforced it? On a high outcrop, a craftsman's bench holds a constellation of small tools, a pair of calipers with finely turned screws, a square ground with surprising accuracy, and a set of punches for marking consistent diameters. The tool's manufacturing quality indicates metalwork and turning skills, and the caliper's thread pitch matches other measuring instruments found across a region. The unexplained matter is not only the precision of these hand tools but their distribution. Identical measuring devices surface at sites associated with different craft traditions, from stonework to metal inlay, suggesting shared standards of measurement. Mainstream craft historiography often treats measurement as local and variable, yet the recurrence of standardized gauges compels a reevaluation of whether shared templates, traveling master tools or circulating pattern books, were in use. Speculative reconstructions consider the possibility of mobile toolkits carried by itinerant measurers who establish local standards for projects, or a mercantile insistence on measurement uniformity to ensure interchangeable parts and predictable trade. A human vignette, the nickname, master gauge, scratched into a handle, reveals pride in a maker's instrument and hints at personal reputations tied to precise tools. If a screw and caliper could harmonize workshops across miles, who carried that standard and by what oath? In a vaulted room whose ceiling once glittered with gold leaf stars, an astronomical map painted on a plaster dome renders constellations with a cartographer's care, scaled positions, labeled zones, and a surprising inclusion of planetary paths traced as bands. The map's orientation and star positions align to a specific epoch, and yet stylistic choices mark it as part scientific chart, part ritual object. The unexplained elements are its dual nature, accurate positions implying serious telescopic-like observation, combined with symbolic embellishments that tie stars to local myth cycles. Mainstream archaeoastronomy recognizes that sky mapping is often both observational and mythical. Temples frequently contain star charts used for liturgical timing. Still, when mapped planetary paths reflect accurate nodal cycles and precessional adjustments, the sophistication implies long-term records and perhaps a dedicated school of observers. Speculative scenarios suggest a clerical or guild institution maintaining multi-generational observations, an archive of sky-watching that functioned as both almanac and liturgy. A human image completes the scene, a marginal pencil sketch of a child's stick figure pointing at a painted planet, a reminder that celestial knowledge was taught, argued over, and passed to curious hands. If the dome held a map of time itself, who kept the ledger of its slow motions? Closing now, the camera pulls back from stone, from the small hands that shaped it, from the tiny tokens kept under thresholds and the soot-streaked notes, folded into liturgy. Across deserts and coastlines, in caves and cloisters, through workshops that smelled of metal and dye and in gardens that guarded their green experiments, a single human story threads. People needed to solve problems, and they did so by moving, by meeting, by trading, by teaching, and by protecting what worked. In these movements, techniques accumulated, traveled, and sometimes vanished. Knowledge is as mobile as the merchants who carried it, as fragile as the parchments that burn, and as stubborn as the stones that outlast their builders. We began this journey with a promise to reveal one connecting clue. The evidence has not led to a single spectacular origin or to a secret archive explaining everything. Instead, the revelation is methodological and modest. Many of the anomalies, the machines plucked from sediment, the precise joints, the undeciphered scripts, the carefully tuned acoustic chambers, and the tiny polished lenses, clustered where people met. Crossroads, ports, pilgrimage routes, storerooms, and courts are where hands exchange techniques as readily as goods. That pattern explains much without demystifying everything. Supply lines brought not only raw materials but also itinerant artisans. Merchant ledgers and portable tokens spread accounting habits. Monastic scriptoria and urban workshops preserved and adapted recipes. And political upheaval, cultural transmission, and the simple perishability of materials decided which traditions survived and which were lost. This is not an enclosed explanation. It is a frame that turns mysteries into questions about social processes of transmission and loss. Why, then, does mystery persist? The answers are manifold. First, the archaeological record is partial. Fragile media, wood, leather, cloth, and many organic binders, decay, leaving behind stone, metal, and ceramic as our primary witnesses. Second, specialized knowledge often travels in embodied forms, skills in hands, exemplars in workshops, apprenticeship rituals, so that much of the craft left no durable text. Third, social choices, religious reform, political consolidation, economic shifts, actively suppressed or absorbed rival techniques and vocabularies. Finally, secrecy and guild protection shaped preservation. Skills hoarded as family secrets, or monopolized by elite patrons may vanish when social orders change. An object that seems inexplicable in isolation often becomes legible when placed in a network of exchange, apprenticeship, and patronage. What does this mean for the present-day investigator? It suggests a methodology. Look for pathways. When a single site offers evidence of an unusual technique, examine its connections. Trade artifacts, shared metrology, similar toolkits, and archival notations that might point to itinerant hands. Cross-disciplinary approaches matter. Materials science opens secrets of alas and pigments. Archaeoacoustics reads chambers for sound intent. Experimental archaeology tests plausibility. And careful archival work can reveal clerks, nicknames, and marginalia that convert enigma into human action. We close with humility and invitation. The past keeps its counsel not because it intends to frustrate us, but because the survival of its knowledge was shaped by brittle contingencies, a flood that wiped a library, a war that scattered artisans, a market that made an innovation irrelevant. The artifacts we have, stones, discs, manuscripts that resist reading, devices half-eaten by corrosion, and tiny polished beads that could be lenses, are fingerprints of a world where ingenuity met social constraint. Each mystery is an invitation to assemble networks of evidence, to read the marginalia and the ledgers together, to test the metallurgy and to listen to the echoes in the caves, to imagine the itinerant teacher who carried a caliper, and to trace the road where a measurement standard was copied from one workshop to another. Imagine the itinerant master, tool chest in hand, teaching a boy to mark a seam. Picture the merchant who kept a stack of tokens under his counter. Think of the monk who tucked a pulley sketch beside a prayer. These are the small, human bridges by which knowledge crossed distance and time. The archaeological anomalies remain wondrous and, in part, unresolved, but they cease to be miracles once we see them as the product of social life, transmission, adaptation, preservation, and loss.